Welcome to Women of Culture. I'm Meera T. Sundararajan. Join me and my distinguished guests to discover untold stories from the world of culture. Poets are always passionate, but is passion always illicit? Hector MacQueen, historian, lawyer, and storyteller, helps us to explore the passion of Robert Burns, today Scotland's national bard, for Clarinda, the married woman who was the love of his life. What happened when that passion stumbled into the cold light of a Scottish courtroom shortly after Burns' death in the early 1800s? Yet, beyond the judgment of the court, beyond the fears of Clarinda's uncle, one of the judges, for his own niece's reputation, beyond Burns and Clarinda themselves, their passion lives on, immortalized in the words of Burns' poem, A Fond Kiss, sung here by Karen Matheson and Paul Brady. In the second part of my interview with Hector MacQueen, the tale continues.
Had we never loved, say kindly, had we never loved, say blindly, never met or never parted, we had ne'er been broken hearted.
Absolutely. I mean, your comments raise a number of interesting questions, so I'm going to try to capture them all here. Maybe the first one is the most striking immediately, because earlier on when you were speaking, you did talk about Robert Burns in two lights, first of all as the National Bard of Scotland, but secondly as a person, as a man of his time with a certain lifestyle, habits, behaviors, and so on. And you said that perhaps many of the personal features of his life might or might not be seen in a favorable light, looked at from today. And now, that sort of brings up again this whole question of the interaction between biography and work in relation to, especially in relation to an important foundational cultural figure like Robert Burns. And it's so interesting how you talk about biography as sort of inherently a form of putting the person up on a pedestal and conveying a certain image of their character, at least at that time. Maybe today taking the opposite approach, which I think is equally flawed in its own way of trying to expose whatever skeletons in the closet might be there and perhaps may or may not be there. All coming down to this question of the truth and perhaps what's relevant or what's important about the biography for understanding the person as a historical figure and as a creator of important works. So I'm always really interested in that reaction. How important is Robert Burns's biography to our understanding of him as an artist, and is that why we're so interested? What is it that makes the biography something so juicy for people, for the public?
Yes. Well, I think it's very hard to disentangle the life and the work. The two go together in a very important way, and have done from the beginning, because we have this initial image of the heaven-born plowman poet this extraordinary figure. And clearly that was not quite the whole truth, shall we say, about Burns. But it's a romantic image, which persists, I think, down to this day, that he was just an ordinary lad who happened to have a poetical genius. So there is an interesting question that's there from the beginning. What exactly enabled Burns to become the poet that he was? And it's very hard to say unless you look at the background, the development. His life was very short.
Yes.
And financially, he was a disaster zone. And ultimately, health-wise, he was a disaster zone as well. He died at the age of 37. And I think it's fairly well established now that his death was caused not so much by alcoholic poisoning as by the mercury in the medicines that he was given to treat his ill health and so on. But the truth of the matter is he was not a very well man when he was prescribed that medication. The reason I think biography is interesting, and it's not just the biography of the famous that I'm thinking of here, is that you see people. And I think that's been my sort of interest in law and history for all my time. I see people in these matters, and it's very hard to do more than get glimpses of the reality, but you want to push it as far as you can. And maybe it's just pure nosiness, ultimately. But
a fundamental human instinct as well.
absolutely. But the thing I always have told students in Edinburgh is that law is about people. It's got very little to recommend it if it's not about people and what people do and what they need in given situations and so on. So for me, law has always been about people, and the same applies to history. But the tantalizing thing in both law and history is that you can only get a glimpse. You don't see the whole story. And maybe you never even know the whole story about people that you spend every day with at work or in your family or whatever. It's always slightly a matter of inference, guesswork, and so on. And trying to make to understand. That's probably what I'm after more than anything else, is to understand what got people to where they were and what made them tick, and get into the situations, the various bad situations, which is what typically law and history are about. What got them there? And do one's best to understand from one's limited experience of life in general.
Yeah, I've often thought that in most, well, I shouldn't say in most, but in many of the famous legal cases that we're exposed to in the course of our studies and so on, there are novels and epics inherent in many of these
Yeah,
incidents, most of which we'll never know. And we're often grateful to the judges, of which there are a handful, who can sort of extract that element or make it apparent in their judgments and somehow
yeah,
bring the human element to the fore, even the poetic
yeah,
element to the fore at times.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And it's also fascinating. I think you talked about trying to glimpse the man. So in this case, trying to glimpse the poet. But you said something more, which is, in fact, for me, it's a question that you raised, which is whether we can find clues to the emergence of the genius in the biography.
Mm, mm, mm.
And that seems like a very slippery idea. So I'd be very curious to know what you think about that.
Yes. the story is essentially that Burns is the descendant of a long line of farmers,
Mm,
essentially.
mm,
Definitely not in the upper echelons of society, but he had a very good teacher, apparently. And there are other signs of basic ability, if you like, in the family, in that other cousins moved on to set up a law firm ultimately in Edinburgh,
oh.
which goes by the name of W&J Burness,
Mm,
Burness, or
mm,
Burness.
mm,
And that firm is still going today, albeit merged with another one, so it's called Burness Paul,
mhm,
Paull.
mm.
Um, but
Interesting.
clearly there was intellectual ability, shall we say, in the family.
Mm,
Um, Different manifestations.
mm,
And you're left to wonder how much was suppressed or failed because the environment in which most of the previous Burneses had been, or Burnesses had been raised, was simply one which did. You are going to labour in the fields. You are
mm,
not going to do anything else. Um, it was young Robert's great good fortune that he was given enough time and a
yeah.
good teacher to read and to make himself capable, shall we say,
Mm,
of writing the work that he ultimately produced.
mm,
So who can say? But it's
mm,
of interest to notice what the other members of the family, in the widest sense, were able to achieve in the
mm,
slightly evolving in atmosphere of the late 18th, early 19th century.
absolutely. And just listening to you talk, I'm thinking the concept of putting the character up on a pedestal isn't necessarily so far wrong in a way, because whether or not we can ultimately find out the reasons for the emergence of genius, I mean, the comments that you're making are very persuasive, but of course, there's always a kernel of mystery remaining at the core of all this,
Yeah,
which may ultimately not be penetrable. But
yeah, yeah,
but on the other hand, knowing about the lives of people like this who are set up as models to emulate in some sense, at least, that is perhaps socially useful as well.
yeah,
But I think then the modern perspective is also an important one there, because we sort of see the strengths and weaknesses of characters, important characters in history, and recognize them as human. Therefore, their achievements as people are not unattainable.
yeah.
So
Yes,
it's a fine balance.
yeah, and perhaps flaws or failures are forgivable,
Mm,
or at least understandable. And
hmm,
yeah, I do think that one should strive for empathy, and I think
hmm,
um, another sort of bit from the law, if you like, the
hmm,
idea of representing your client and putting forward the
hmm,
best case you can for the client is actually useful in that regard. I mean, we're having a debate in the UK at the moment about legal aid and
hmm.
helping the
Oh,
bad
yes.
guys, so on and so forth.
Hmm. Oh,
But
goodness.
the horrible truth is that that bad guy could be you or me in
Yeah.
slightly different circumstances. And
Hmm,
it behoves us to realize that and to
hmm,
not be quite so punitive
hmm,
in our response to that situation
hmm.
or these
Absolutely.
situations. Mm,
These
mm.
situations, yes,
Yes.
absolutely. I mean, turning again to the law, there was a second point that came up that I didn't want to fail mention, which is I really enjoyed how you talked about this sort of core idea of the protection of the personality from insults, and
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
that concept filters down into the legal systems of different jurisdictions and takes on a particular form, I think, depending on the legal context. Because much of what you have spoken about in relation to Robert Burns is something that I would recognize as part of the legal theory of moral rights.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and I don't think you'll be at all surprised by my bringing that up at the moment.
no,
Um,
absolutely not.
but of course that's a context that's well recognized in continental Europe and in many other countries as well, in Asia and so on, where there is a reputational interest of the author, whether you call it the professional reputation or the honor at a personal level as well,
Mm, yeah.
which must somehow be recognized by the law. And in those particular contexts, they're able to do that through the framework of the author's rights, as they call it, or the copyright, of course, as we call it.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it does seem like a very rich area that has led to different doctrinal interpretations in different places. Uh, what's particularly interesting to me is that the moral rights idea is so well accepted in European countries, but then, of course, it is roundly rejected as such in the tradition of, I would have said British law before this conversation, but I say
Hmm. Hmm.
English law without hesitation. Um,
Yeah,
but it does seem that the situation of Scottish law is a little bit different when it comes to personality rights. So
yeah.
this is a slightly more technical question, but I am so curious to hear what you think about the relationship between all of this and moral rights that I won't resist my
Yeah.
desire to ask you.
Well, I think there probably is an important connection. It's not something I've ever investigated, but it's something I've often thought. The idea of the actio injuriarum, which I mentioned earlier, comes to us from Roman law. And Roman law reflected a society that was driven very much by notions of honor and what honor
Mm,
required, and it was very wide ranging. So that there were many things which should be done gratuitously because the honourable man, and it was usually a man that we were talking about,
mm,
would do them. For example, he would render services or representation on behalf of another. And he would do it gratuitously because honor required that
mm,
a high ranking individual should do that for those with whom he was connected. So it was an
mm,
honor society, and the Actio
mm,
Injuriarum reflected that. It was about insults that dishonored someone to whom honor was actually due. And I think
mm,
that idea certainly percolated widely in those parts of Europe where Roman law was influential from the Middle Ages
mm,
on. And of course,
mm,
notoriously, England was not
mm,
a society in which Roman law had that effect. Now,
mm,
I think one has to be very, very careful here.
mm,
I'm pretty convinced from the reading that I've done that England was an honour society like any other
mm,
in Europe. It was just that the law didn't quite get there. And there
mm.
are many
Oh,
historical reasons
interesting.
why that might be so, but let's not
Mm,
get into that.
mm, mm.
Um,
That may be a
but it
separate
definitely was,
podcast interview.
yeah, yes,
Sorry,
quite.
please go on.
But definitely, the law did not get there. But I think the Scots
Mm,
law did. Um,
mm,
uh, but the problem for Scots law was that in the course of the 19th century, it became heavily influenced by English law ideas. And what you can
mm,
see with regard to the precedent that was formed by the case about the Burns Clarinda correspondence was that it
mm,
became isolated. It was parked in a corner, and other cases went in different directions and
mm,
used different legal bases for it. And the result today is that we are in much the same mess
mm,
as English law has been for the last at least 40 years. It seems to be in a mess
mm,
all through professional career on this
mm,
particular subject. Yeah, I think the Roman law influence is very important and it's how far your legal system allows the Roman law to percolate through into the substance of its rules that is vital here.
mm, mm. Can I ask a slightly provocative question? But it is one that crosses my mind sometimes, which is, you talked about England as being an honor based society, but the situation of the law being one where it didn't quite touch that social norm or that
Mm,
aspect of the social fabric. But what is the situation today? I mean, can we look at a case like this case involving the letters, Robert Burns' letters to
mm.
Clarinda, and understand what this case is about? And I'm not only speaking about the gender dimension of it, but in
Yeah.
particular the idea that honor was at stake. Is this a concept that we continue to understand well today, and is it one we're going to understand in the future?
Well, one of the things that I think is difficult today, and that we looked at in the Law Commission when I was a commissioner, was how far do things like honor and dishonor, for that matter, survive death?
Ah,
And a pretty standard rule in modern English and Scottish law is that you cannot defame the dead. So off we can go and write our histories and biographies and so on and say what we like, so long as the person is dead. There's no right in anyone else to take action to protect the good name of a deceased person. And that is completely contrary, it seems to me, to what the Burns Clarinda case held,
yeah.
because there it's quite clear that the critical thing was that the family were the only people who could defend the good name of their deceased relative. And there's quite a lot of force in that. I think it has to
Yeah.
be said. If you're going to have a concept of honor and dishonor in law, then who's going to enforce it once the dishonored person is no longer with us? Um, and in the Law Commission, when I was there, we discussed the law of defamation. In fact, there's a Defamation Act now on the statute book as a result. But one of the
Mm,
questions was, should the rule on defamation of the dead be changed? It only emerged in the course of the 19th century.
uh-huh.
Um, uh, and I argued that actually it was probably a mistake that the law had developed in that particular way. It was down to the wicked English. And the point was that there had been a case, not a case that ever got to court, but a case that attracted a lot of public notoriety and interest, where a child, teenager,
Mm,
had committed suicide because of bullying at a school. And in our social media world, there had been a lot of activity, and various statements were made about the deceased, which had the child been alive still, and had they
mm,
been thought to be untrue, would have been
yeah.
defamatory. and the
Yeah.
family was
Sad.
lobbying for
Mm.
rights to take action.
Mm.
And I had quite a lot of sympathy with that case.
Yeah,
Very different
absolutely.
case from the Burns one. But nonetheless, the principle of the Burns case, the family has an entitlement, and not just an interest, but an entitlement to protect the good name of their deceased family member. Seems to me not an impossibly onerous requirement to impose on society by way of the law of defamation.
Mm.
But I didn't win that argument in the commission.
Mm. That's
And
unfortunate.
well, it's who can say, because I mean there are undoubtedly difficulties if the dead can be defamed. How are you going to limit the group who can take action? The fact it's all very well talking about the family, but once we get beyond the nuclear family, what are we talking about? Even in the Burns case, in the end, it was Burns' brother, who might not be a person that you would think of immediately in general family context, along with the person who had legal responsibility for the children, the factor, as we call such people in Scotland,
Mm.
Burns' surviving children, for
Mm.
their interest. But it was really Burns's brother.
Mm.
And our brothers, the kind of people we're talking about, or sisters for that matter, in this area. So yeah, I didn't press my argument in the commission tremendously hard against all the very well thought out objections that my colleagues had. I think it is difficult, but nonetheless, I think there is an issue which a blanket rule that you cannot defame the dead fails to address.
Mm. Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because the job that you would face, being in that position where you're looking at law reform, or indeed that judges face on a fairly regular basis, is
Yeah.
just this, how to take a concept that may be very right and proper in its own way, but then trying to apply it in the details. It's a very difficult exercise, and that's
Hmm.
why highly qualified people such as yourself are needed for this type
Yeah.
of work. Um,
Yeah.
but it doesn't surprise me, Hector, that you would take that position, just given your uh, sort of historical perspective on a lot of these matters. Um, and and I think my reaction, which is instantaneous, is because for me, as a scholar who has focused a lot on the moral rights dimension of copyright law, this is a key difference between moral rights and those actions that you describe, such as defamation, because
Mm.
the moral rights do continue, as you know very
Yeah.
well, after the death of the author, and in many jurisdictions they continue forever. So there is a kind of non-time limited right of reputation that is recognized in at least some contexts in a number of jurisdictions in the world, and it does prove to be very difficult to interpret and implement that in practice. Not surprisingly,
Yeah.
um, but I think you earlier on you raised a point about the preservation of truth,
Mm.
which to me is perhaps the strongest argument in favor of all this. But the moment I say that, we then confront the problem that you raised, which is who is the true keeper of the truth. uh,
Yes.
and with my own experience with literary families, which, as you know, is quite substantial.
Thank
uh,
you.
I,
Yes.
I, yes, I can assure you that it is not obvious at all amongst family members, and we see this all the time. I wonder if there
Yeah.
almost should be some way of conceptualizing a broader public interest in the notion of honor.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because of course the families are damaged. For example, even in that very tragic case that you described, which I'm sure is not a unique case,
No.
unfortunately. We can definitely see how the families are desperately affected, but at the same time, for us as a society, it does seem that we are lacking at a certain level a concept of honor in terms of dealing with not only dealing with the dead, but dealing with the families and just the norms of behavior that have become common in the era of social media, especially.
Well,
So, hmm,
public interest, public policy was mentioned in the Burns case, and in particular by Lord Craig, Clarinda's
hmm,
undisclosed relative. He's the one who talks about what we would now call trash can journalism as something that's just outrageous and should be stopped. it's,
hmm,
it's not in the public interest to have all this sort of stuff brought out into the open and people rooting around for bad material.
hmm.
Um, I think part of the answer to that is the famous line about public interest is about what's interesting to the public,
Oh dear.
and the public is very interested in many things that it shouldn't be. So I think there is a difficulty. I mean, the modern counterpart in the UK is with regard to the tabloid press and how far we should allow it to proceed in an untrammeled way, or whether bodies like the Press Complaints Commission or whatever it's called nowadays, it seems to get its name changed pretty regularly,
Hmm.
should be there to sort of keep this public interest idea and ensure that the reputation of the press itself is not sullied by the behavior of some of its members and representatives. Um, uh, so I think that public interest argument is it's certainly always present, but I feel that it's a two-edged
Yeah,
sword. That
much
it
so.
becomes too much about a certain elite deciding what it is that the plebs should be allowed to know, and so on and so forth. And speaking for myself as a lawyer and as a historian, I think we are entitled to know things,
Hmm.
so that a right of privacy or a right to prevent dishonor shouldn't become a means of simply maintaining an essentially false
Yeah,
reputation. And that's why the whole area is so fraught and difficult.
yeah.
It's and when we talked about defaming the dead in the commission,
Hmm.
my colleagues were quite rightly pointing out the immense
Hmm.
difficulties, how to define the family for these purposes, how long would this last, would grandchildren, great grandchildren be in a position to bring actions to defend their, and how far would the truth be suppressed? I mean,
Yeah,
ultimately, the truth argument is the winner, at least in the modern setting,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah, on the whole, I support that. But I think there are parameters within which the pursuit of the truth should be carried out.
Hmm. Well, in the case of Burns, I mean, I think that's a slightly different scenario as well, because we're talking about his own words ultimately, and
Yeah.
it does seem to me to be terribly dangerous when people who come afterwards are trying to determine the morality of the words of a poet, of an important writer. Uh,
Hmm,
this,
hmm.
this is something, by the way, that we've seen in my own family with Subramania Bharati, who I
Yes.
think it would be fair to call him the Burns of South India in many
Yes.
ways.
Yes.
Um, but he had written a series of love songs, which outside that time and place, it seems extremely innocent because they were love songs that he wrote to his own wife. what a what a
Right.
concept!
That's
What a
not too
novel
bad.
concept! and and but the interesting thing is he named his wife. His wife's name became part of the poetry of the words of those
Right.
songs. And after he died, when publication eventually found its way into the hands of his half brother and other family members by way of his wife, his widow. She had first tried to do some publication herself and had to give up that project at a certain point. But when it found its way to others, the people involved actually removed her name and put in another name in those poems,
Right.
a
Right.
name of a fictional character or a mystical character, I would say, that Bharati has written about in
Right.
some of his other poems in the religious tradition of the Shakti worship in South India. So
Yeah.
not only did they essentially erase her participation from the poems, and I think thereby from history to an extent as well,
Yeah.
but then they completely changed the context of the poetry, potentially to a more religious or fantastic context rather than a real historical one. So when my mother, who was a Bharati scholar, republished the originals of those poems with her name replaced, and that was an important service to historical truth as well as to her
Yeah.
grandmother. So truth wins the day, as far as I'm concerned, as well.
Yes.
um,
Yes. Yes.
and the determination of the morals of these situations, especially by family members, is very questionable. I don't
Yeah.
have an answer, but
No. No.
I have to definitely recognize the value of the question.
Yes.
I'm conscious of how long I've kept you as well. So, shall we perhaps conclude with one question, which I think you've started to answer, which is simply going back to the case. What do
Yes.
you think? What do you think was the right solution? What should have happened, and what should happen now?
Yes, well, I think the solution at the time was the right one, and I think
Mm.
the basic position, the legal position, that the letters you send to someone else do not become that person's unfettered property rights, so that they can share it for publication purposes with anyone. Permission should be sought, and that I think is a legitimate response to the scenario that presented itself in the Burns case. And the reality was that, I mean, these letters might have been shocking in some sense of the late 18th, early 19th century, but the truth of the matter was that actually nothing was revealed that could be dishonorable to, in particular, Burns
Mm.
at the or he would have had excuses, at least he would have had defenses. The difficulty really was the position of Clarinda. And
Yes.
by the time the case was brought, was she any longer in a scenario where it was disgraceful, scandalous that she was living apart from her husband? The husband was in
Mm.
Jamaica. The husband was behaving very badly,
Mm.
and so on. So I don't think her position was quite as difficult. And in my article, I suggest that perhaps she wasn't as innocent as she made herself. Well, in fairness, not that she made herself out to be, but that others made her out to be.
Yes.
She wasn't the innocent dupe in the matter. Um, but I think it was the right decision, and that permissions should have been obtained to publish it, and that probably they would have been forthcoming. I mean, the Burns
Mm.
family was making loads of money out of Burns, and eventually Clarinda's family. That's the really amusing thing. It was her grandson who finally published the entire
Yeah.
correspondence, her letters as well as Burns's letters, in 1843. And by then, the world was not shocked; it just lapped it up.
What if that
Um,
hadn't happened? What would have been the fate of the letters?
well, perhaps at the point of Clarinda's demise, which was very late, 1841, 1842. And the letters, the full correspondence, not just Burns' side of it, but the full correspondence was published in 1843 by the
Oh.
grandson. So
Mm.
the grandson knew that there was money in this, and
Mm.
I think he emigrated to Canada actually fairly shortly. years.
I'll have to look into that.
You probably by that time, 60 years after the correspondence had taken place, or nearly 60 years, you had moved beyond the point where it could hurt or damage anyone. And it was just all part of the interest of the past. This poet who held this extraordinary position in Scottish culture, and not just Scottish culture. I mean, there are loads of statues of Burns in Canada,
Yes,
Australia, the United
of course.
States, and so on. So he was an absolutely global figure,
Hmm.
at least within the British Empire as it then
Mm.
stood.
Yes, and not only did Clarinda's family gain financially, but there is a maybe a slightly more gratifying result as well, which is that Clarinda gained her immortality as
Yes.
one of the muses. In fact, more than a muse, it sounds like an associate and an intellectual companion for
Yeah, yeah.
Burns.
No, I think she was probably the love of Burns' life.
Mm.
Um, I mean, he ended up married to Jean Armour, but I don't think she held a candle, really, so far as Burns was
Mm.
concerned, to Clarinda in terms of her intellectual interests and so on. One of my friends here in Edinburgh, a novelist called Donald Smith, has written a book in which he imagines an encounter between Clarinda and Jean Armour.
Oh,
It's
fantastic!
it's a very nice novel. I'm sorry I can't remember the title. I'd have brought it with me if I'd remembered that I might mention it. But perhaps the name Donald Smith will be enough for those who want to hunt on Amazon for this book.
Yes, absolutely. So at the end of it all, we're left with, I guess, two enduring mysteries. One, which, as I understand it, was never actually solved in the case, which is
No.
what was Clarinda's position? Had she given her consent or not?
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and then, secondly, of course, the enduring mystery of the human heart and
Yes.
the nature of Robert Burns's attachment and the mystery of his life as it
Yep. Yep.
unfolded apart from the love of his life.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
So the mysteries endure.
Yeah. He's a fascinating figure, and I think he will remain so for quite some time to come.
Thank you so much, Hector, for your
Well, thank you,
fascinating
Neil.
insights. It's been just such a pleasure. I've kept you for quite a long interview, but I could have asked you more questions and we could have spoken for longer because the subject
Sure.
is so rich and your reflections so interesting. So thank you very
Well, that's
much.
very kind of you.
Fare thee well, thou first and fairest. Fare thee well, thou best and dearest. Thine be the joy and treasure, peace, enjoyment, love, and pleasure. Wave and kiss, and then we sever. Farewell, alas, forever. Deep in heart richly